"This is my house, officer. You already have the proof in your hand." Danielle Brooks stood beneath the warm yellow light of her own garage, the rear hatch of her black sport utility vehicle still open behind her, grocery bags resting beside a leather work bag in the cargo area. Sergeant Eric Dalton held her driver's license between two fingers and looked from the photograph to her face, then toward the quiet two-story home attached to the garage. The address printed on the license matched the house exactly. Danielle knew it. Officer Brian Cole knew it. Eric knew it too. And still, nobody moved. The neighborhood around them was almost silent, the kind of Northern Virginia suburb where porch lights glowed behind trimmed hedges, and people usually worried more about package deliveries than police radios. Danielle had pulled into her driveway less than 5 minutes earlier after a long day in Washington. She had expected to carry groceries inside, answer one final email, and change into something comfortable. Instead, 2 police officers were standing in her garage, asking her to prove she belonged there. "Ma'am, stay where you are while we verify the residence," Eric said. Danielle looked at the license still in his hand. "What exactly are you verifying?" Eric's jaw tightened slightly. "We received a report of a suspicious person entering this property." Danielle glanced toward the open garage door, then back at him. "I entered through the garage using the remote in my car. That does not establish ownership." She drew a slow breath. "The driver's license you are holding lists this address." Brian shifted his weight near the driveway. He looked at the license, then at the brass numbers mounted beside the garage. The numbers matched. His expression changed, but he did not speak. Eric continued, "Do you have another way to prove you live here?" Danielle almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the question. She reached carefully toward her phone resting on the workbench. "My garage application shows this property. My utility account is on the phone. You can also check county property records." Eric raised one hand. "Do not reach for anything until I tell you." Danielle stopped immediately. Her hands remained visible. Her voice stayed level. "Then you check it." Eric looked at her as though the calmness itself bothered him. "You seem very comfortable telling officers what to do." Danielle held his gaze. "I am telling you how to verify what you are asking." Brian glanced again toward the license. "Sergeant, the address does match." Eric did not look at him. "Addresses can be outdated." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then check the vehicle registration." Eric looked toward the sport utility vehicle. "Is that your vehicle?" "Yes." "Registered here?" "Yes." "Do you have documentation?" Danielle pointed with her eyes toward the glove compartment. "You can verify it electronically." Another pause. Another solution ignored. A small red light above the interior garage door blinked steadily. Danielle noticed it. Her home security camera was recording. The doorbell camera outside was recording too. And on Eric's uniform, a body camera light showed that his version of the encounter was also being preserved. Danielle let that fact settle her breathing. "Sergeant Dalton," she said, reading the name on his uniform. "You have my identification. You have the correct address. Your officer has confirmed the match. What information are you waiting for?" Eric glanced toward Brian, then back at her. "I decide when this is verified." That sentence changed something in Danielle's expression. Not fear. Recognition. She had heard versions of it before, in hearings, reports, and interviews where authority slowly stopped being about facts and became about control. She reached no farther for her phone. She made no attempt to enter the house. Instead, she stood beside her groceries in the garage she had paid for, beneath a camera she had installed, while a stranger holding proof of her address continued asking whether she belonged there. Then Eric looked toward the leather work bag in the back of her vehicle. A black credential case was partially visible inside. He pointed toward it. "What is that?" Danielle followed his gaze. "Work identification." Brian noticed the gold edge of a federal seal. Eric did not. Not yet. Danielle looked at the body camera on his chest and asked one quiet question. "Is that recording everything?" Eric answered without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am." Danielle gave a small nod. "Good." He mistook the word for attitude. Brian did not. And inside that leather bag, less than 3 feet away, was the credential that would change the entire meaning of the next few minutes. 40 minutes earlier, Danielle Brooks had been driving west out of Washington beneath a sky that had already turned deep blue over the Potomac, the last of the evening traffic glowing red in long lines ahead of her. She had left a federal office building later than planned, carrying the same leather work bag now resting in the back of her sport utility vehicle, along with a government parking credential and a stack of reading material she intended to review the next morning. Nothing about the drive felt unusual. She stopped at a grocery store near Arlington, picked up coffee, vegetables, pasta, and a carton of eggs, then stood for a moment in the checkout line answering a message from her daughter, Kayla, who was away at college in North Carolina. When Danielle finally called her from the parking lot, Kayla answered on the second ring. "You are still working, are you not?" she asked. Danielle smiled as she placed the groceries in the back of the vehicle. "I am leaving work now." "That is not what I asked." Danielle laughed softly. Kayla knew her too well. They spoke for nearly 10 minutes about classes, an upcoming economics exam, and whether Kayla had remembered to schedule an oil change before driving home the following month. Danielle listened more than she talked. Whatever responsibilities followed her through federal hallways during the day, she was still a mother reminding her daughter to eat something besides cafeteria pizza. Before hanging up, Kayla said, "Go home. Eat dinner. Stop reading reports tonight." Danielle promised nothing. She only said, "I will try." The drive from Arlington into the quieter neighborhoods of Northern Virginia took less than half an hour. Danielle preferred the transition. Government buildings disappeared behind her. Traffic thinned. Office towers became grocery stores. Schools, and rows of two-story homes with porch lights beginning to glow. She had lived in the same house for almost 7 years. She knew which neighbor walked a golden retriever after sunset, which family left bicycles near the sidewalk, and which porch usually displayed fresh flowers even in early spring. Home was supposed to be the place where she stopped explaining herself. As she turned onto her street, she noticed a moving truck parked 3 houses away. A new family had arrived the previous weekend, though Danielle had not yet introduced herself. She made a mental note to do it when work became less demanding. That thought would matter later. At 7:23, she pulled into her driveway and pressed the garage remote clipped above the visor. The door rose smoothly. She drove inside, shut off the engine, and sat for a few seconds in the sudden quiet. Her phone displayed 3 unread work messages. She looked at them, then remembered Kayla's voice. "Go home. Eat dinner." Danielle turned the screen face down. She stepped out, opened the rear hatch, and began gathering grocery bags. Her leather work bag had shifted during the drive, revealing the edge of a black credential case inside. She pushed it back beneath a folder without thinking. Across the street, a porch light came on. Danielle did not notice the woman standing near the window of the recently occupied house, looking toward the open garage with uncertainty. The woman had never met Danielle. She had heard neighbors discussing a recent series of package thefts and garage break-ins several blocks away. From where she stood, she could see only a black woman moving between a dark vehicle and a house she did not yet associate with her. Danielle carried one grocery bag toward the interior door, then returned for another. Her garage camera detected motion and began recording automatically. At the same time, from a house across the street, a nervous neighbor reached for her phone and called the non-emergency police number. Danielle knew none of this. She was thinking about dinner, her daughter, and whether she had enough energy to read one more report before bed. By the time she lifted the final grocery bag from the vehicle, a patrol car had already turned onto her street. The patrol car slowed as it entered the quiet neighborhood, its headlights moving across trimmed lawns, parked cars, and the open garage where Danielle Brooks was still unloading groceries. Sergeant Eric Dalton sat behind the wheel, while Officer Brian Cole looked down at the call notes on the dashboard screen. The report was simple. Suspicious person at a residence. Possible unauthorized entry. No visible damage. No reported threat. The caller was a neighbor who had recently moved into the area and did not recognize the woman entering the garage. That was all. Nothing in the call said the woman had forced a door. Nothing said she had taken anything. Nothing said she was dangerous. Brian read the notes twice. "Looks like a welfare or property check," he said. Eric gave a small nod. "We will see." Across the street, Sarah Mitchell stood near her front window, still holding her phone. She had moved into the neighborhood less than 2 weeks earlier with her husband and young son. Most of the faces around her were still unfamiliar. Earlier that afternoon, another neighbor had mentioned package thefts several blocks away and warned everyone to keep garage doors closed. So when Sarah saw Danielle pull into the house across the street, open the garage, and move in and out of the vehicle, she became uncertain. She did not know Danielle. She did not know who owned the house. She called the non-emergency number because she thought that was the responsible thing to do. But when the patrol car arrived, Sarah immediately began to wonder whether she had overreacted. Danielle looked nothing like someone trying to hide. She was standing beneath bright garage lights with grocery bags in plain view. Her vehicle was parked normally inside. The interior door to the house was open behind her. Sarah stepped away from the window, uncomfortable now, but the call had already become someone else's decision. Eric parked near the curb and got out. Brian followed. Danielle noticed them as she lifted a paper grocery bag from the cargo area. She looked toward the officers, then toward the street, assuming at first they were responding to something nearby. Eric walked directly toward the driveway. "Ma'am, can you stop for a moment?" Danielle set the bag carefully on the garage floor. "Is there a problem?" "We received a call about someone entering this property." Danielle glanced behind her at the kitchen door. "I live here." Brian looked around the garage. Family storage bins lined one wall. A winter coat hung near the interior entrance. Mail sat on a small shelf beside reusable shopping bags. Everything about the space looked lived in. Eric asked, "Can you show identification?" Danielle reached slowly into her handbag and handed him her driver's license. He read the name first, Danielle Brooks, then the address. It matched the numbers beside the garage. Brian noticed that immediately. "The address matches," he said. Danielle gave a small nod. "Because this is my home." That should have been the end of it. A reasonable call. A reasonable check. A verified address. But Eric did not hand the license back. He looked at the house again, then at Danielle's vehicle. "How long have you lived here?" Danielle paused. "Almost 7 years. Anyone else live with you?" The question made her expression change. Not dramatically, just enough. "Why does that matter if my identification matches this address?" Eric's tone remained controlled. "We are verifying the situation." Danielle looked at the license still in his hand. "You already verified it." Brian shifted his weight. He could feel the encounter changing. The original call had been about whether someone belonged at the property. The identification had answered that question. Now Eric was asking new ones. "Is the vehicle registered to you?" he asked. Danielle looked toward the black sport utility vehicle. "Yes." Eric continued. "Can you prove that?" Brian glanced at him. "Sergeant, we can run the plate." Eric ignored the suggestion for a moment. Danielle stayed composed. "Please do." Eric looked back at her, and something subtle passed across his face. He had arrived expecting uncertainty. Instead, he found a woman who answered calmly, knew exactly what could be verified, and did not appear intimidated by his questions. Rather than reassuring him, her confidence seemed to make him more suspicious. The call had given him a reason to check. The evidence had given him a reason to stop. But now another force had entered the encounter, quieter than the radio and harder to name. Assumption. Brian looked toward Sarah's house and saw movement behind the curtain. Danielle followed his gaze. "Did a neighbor call you?" Brian answered before Eric could. "Yes, ma'am. Someone did not recognize you." Danielle looked back at the houses lining the street. Then perhaps they should introduce themselves. There was no anger in her voice, only disappointment. Eric finally handed back the license, but he did not step away. Instead, his eyes moved toward the leatherwork bag inside the vehicle. "What kind of work do you do?" Danielle looked at him carefully. The original question had been answered, but the questioning was not over. Danielle held Eric Dalton's gaze for a moment before answering. "I work in Washington." Eric looked toward the leather bag inside the vehicle again. "Doing what?" "Federal work." Brian Cole shifted slightly beside him. The answer should have been enough because the original reason for the call had nothing to do with Danielle's employment. But Eric had already moved beyond the original question. He was no longer trying to determine whether she lived there. He was trying to make the facts fit the suspicion he had brought with him. Danielle recognized the difference. "Sergeant, you came here because someone questioned whether I belonged at this address. My license matches the house. The vehicle can be verified. The garage opened with my remote. What exactly are you investigating now?" Eric's expression hardened. "I am making sure everything checks out." Danielle nodded toward the driver's license now back in her hand. "Then check it." Brian looked at the patrol computer through the windshield. "I can run the plate right now." Eric gave him a quick glance. "Do it." Brian walked back toward the cruiser. Danielle remained where she was, one grocery bag still sitting on the garage floor beside her. The automatic garage light cast a warm circle around the space, but the evening beyond the driveway felt colder now. Across the street, Sarah Mitchell stood behind her curtain, watching with increasing discomfort. She had expected an officer to ask a few questions and leave. Instead, the conversation had stretched on. Danielle could feel the eyes from neighboring windows. That was what made the moment heavier. It was not only being questioned, it was being questioned publicly, in front of people who would remember the scene long after they forgot why it started. Eric pointed toward Danielle's phone on the workbench. You said you can show the garage application? Yes. Open it. Danielle picked up the phone slowly and unlocked it. She opened the smart home application and held the screen where he could see the registered garage door, the property address, and the recent entry time. Eric studied it. That can be shared between users. Danielle looked at him. So can a house key. That does not make it meaningless. He did not respond. You can also check the county property records, she continued. My name is on the deed. Eric folded his arms. I do not need you telling me how to conduct an investigation. Danielle's voice stayed calm. Then conduct one. Brian returned from the patrol car. Sergeant, the plate comes back to Danielle Brooks at this address. Silence. Danielle looked from Brian to Eric. That is the third verification. Eric glanced at the house again. Vehicle registration does not prove who owns the property. Brian's eyes shifted toward him. The doubt was clearer now. It proves her vehicle is registered here. Eric ignored him. Danielle drew a slow breath. My driver's license matches. My vehicle registration matches. My garage account matches. You can check the deed. What fact are you waiting for? Eric looked directly at her. I am waiting for something that makes sense. The sentence hung between them. Danielle's expression changed. Not anger. Something quieter. More serious. What does not make sense to you? Eric hesitated just long enough for the question to expose itself. Brian looked away. Sarah, still watching from across the street, felt her stomach tighten. Danielle waited. Eric finally said, people use addresses that are not theirs. Cars get borrowed. Accounts get shared. All true, Danielle replied. But you have not identified a single fact showing that any of those things happened here. Eric's jaw tightened. You are being argumentative. No, I am being precise. She pointed gently toward his body camera. And precision matters when you are creating a record. Brian's attention moved to the blinking light on Eric's uniform. Danielle continued. You have now been given 3 independent pieces of information confirming I live here. If you continue this detention, I want your report to state each one clearly. Eric looked at her as though the word detention bothered him. Nobody said you were detained. Danielle glanced toward the open interior door. Can I go inside my house? Eric paused. Not yet. Danielle nodded once. Then I am detained. Brian looked at Eric. The logic was impossible to avoid. A quiet radio transmission came from the patrol car, confirming once again that the registered vehicle owner matched the address. Eric said nothing. Danielle's leatherwork bag remained inside the open cargo area, the edge of the black credential case barely visible beneath a folder. Brian noticed the gold seal again. This time he looked longer. Sergeant, he said carefully, maybe we should check her work identification. Eric turned toward the bag. Danielle followed his eyes. For chances had already passed. A fifth was sitting less than 3 feet away. Eric Dalton looked toward the leatherwork bag, but did not move immediately. For the first time since arriving, he seemed aware that every new question was creating another answer he would eventually have to explain. Brian Cole stood near the patrol car, watching him carefully. The vehicle registration had matched. The driver's license had matched. The garage application had matched. The house number was visible 10 feet away. And still, the encounter continued. Eric finally took out a small incident notebook. I am documenting the contact, he said. Danielle Brooks gave a slow nod. Then document it accurately. He began writing. Suspicious person call. Resident unable to immediately establish connection to property. Danielle heard the words as he spoke them quietly to himself. Her expression changed. That is not accurate. Eric looked up. What part? The part where you say I could not establish residency. He closed the notebook halfway. You did not establish it immediately. Danielle pointed toward the license in her hand. I gave you this within the first minute. Brian looked down at the pavement. He remembered it too. Eric replied. We had to verify further. Because you chose to. The words were calm, but they landed sharply. Eric glanced toward his body camera. Danielle followed his eyes. Your recording will show when I handed you the license, correct? He hesitated. Yes. It will also show Officer Cole confirming the address. Brian looked up. Danielle continued. And the vehicle registration. And the garage account. Eric's face tightened. I know what it will show. Then write what happened. Silence settled over the driveway. Across the street, Sarah Mitchell had stepped outside onto her porch. She stood with her arms folded, no longer hiding behind the curtain. She looked embarrassed now, as if she wanted to undo the call, but did not know how. Danielle noticed her, but said nothing. This had stopped being about the neighbor several minutes ago. Eric turned another page in the notebook. What is in the work bag? Danielle looked toward the open cargo area. Personal work materials. Federal work materials? Some are. Brian's eyes moved again to the black credential case, partly visible beneath a folder. The gold edge of the seal caught the garage light. Sergeant, he said carefully, there is government identification in the bag. Eric looked at him. I see it. Danielle spoke before either officer could continue. If you want to verify my employment, I can hand it to you. Eric studied her for a moment. Slowly, Danielle moved toward the cargo area at the pace he requested, reached into the leather bag, and removed the credential case. She did not open it. She held it out. Eric took it, but kept his eyes on her instead of the cover. What agency? He asked. Danielle's voice remained even. Read it. Brian shifted closer by half a step. Eric opened the case only enough to see the seal, then stopped. He did not yet read the title beneath the photograph. Instead, he looked back at Danielle. Why did you not mention federal employment earlier? Because owning my home should not depend on where I work. Brian's expression changed immediately. That answer made sense in a way the rest of the encounter no longer did. Eric looked down at the credential case again. The words United States Department of Justice were clearly visible now. His posture stiffened. Danielle watched him carefully. Is your body camera still recording? She asked. Eric looked almost irritated by the question. Yes. And Officer Coles? Brian answered this time. Yes, ma'am. Danielle nodded once. Good. No threat. No raised voice. Just one word. Eric looked down at the notebook where he had written that she could not immediately establish residency. Brian looked at the license, then at the credential case, then at the blinking camera on his own uniform. 3 different records. 3 different forms of proof, all pointing in the same direction. Eric had not realized it yet, but the most important witness on the driveway was no longer Danielle, Brian, or the neighbor across the street. It was the record itself, and the record had been watching from the beginning. Hours before the patrol car turned onto her street, Danielle Brooks had been sitting beneath the bright conference lights of a federal office building in Washington, surrounded by attorneys, policy analysts, and civil rights specialists reviewing a series of local law enforcement complaints from several jurisdictions. The meeting had lasted longer than anyone planned. One report described a driver questioned long after registration had been confirmed. Another involved a homeowner whose identification matched the address, yet officers continued demanding additional proof. None of the cases were identical. None of them, standing alone, automatically established misconduct. Danielle had insisted on that point. We do not build conclusions from outrage, she told the room. We build them from records, repetition, and what officers do after uncertainty has been resolved. People listened carefully when Danielle spoke, not because she raised her voice, but because she rarely wasted words. At 46, she had spent more than 2 decades working through the legal system, beginning with civil rights litigation before moving into federal service. She was now a Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, overseeing teams that examined patterns of public authority, institutional accountability, and the difference between a reasonable initial question and an unreasonable refusal to accept an answer. Her work was not about attacking police departments. She said that often. It was about making sure public power remained tied to facts. An officer is allowed to ask questions, Danielle had said during the afternoon meeting. The problem begins when the answer no longer matters. That sentence stayed with several people in the room after the meeting ended. Danielle did not know it would follow her home too. By early evening, she had closed her briefing folder, slipped her credential case into the leatherwork bag, and left the building believing the most difficult part of her day was over. Now, standing inside her own garage, she watched Sergeant Eric Dalton hold that same credential case without yet understanding what he was looking at. Brian Cole had already seen enough of the seal to recognize the agency. Eric had seen it too, but pride was slowing him down. Danielle could almost read the conflict on his face. If he opened the credential fully, He would have to accept that the woman he had continued questioning was not only the verified homeowner, but a senior federal official whose career centered on exactly this kind of encounter. Yet Danielle did not tell him. Not because she was setting a trap. Not because she wanted the satisfaction of watching his expression change. She simply believed the title should not be necessary. Her driver's license should have been enough. The vehicle registration should have been enough. The property record, if checked, would have been enough. Even the garage application should have moved the encounter toward closure. Her employment had nothing to do with whether she had the right to stand inside her own home. Brian looked from the credential case to Danielle. "Sergeant, you should read the full identification." Eric glanced at him. "I know what agency it is." "Then read the title." Danielle remained silent. Across the street, Sarah Mitchell had moved closer to the edge of her porch. She could not hear every word, but she could see the change in the younger officer's posture. The encounter no longer looked like a simple property check. Eric finally lowered his eyes to the credential. United States Department of Justice. The line beneath Danielle's photograph was still partly covered by his thumb. He shifted his grip. Danielle watched the movement without changing expression. The gold seal caught the garage light. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the patrol radio crackled from the driveway. Dispatch had completed another property verification. Brian turned toward the sound. "Sergeant, county records confirmed Danielle Brooks as the registered homeowner." Eric looked at Danielle, then back at the credential. The original question had now been answered in every possible way. But the next line he was about to read would answer a question he had never thought to ask. Who exactly had he decided not to believe? Eric Dalton shifted his thumb from the credential and finally read the full title beneath Danielle Brooks's photograph. Deputy Assistant Attorney General, United States Department of Justice. For several seconds, the only sound in the garage came from the low hum of the overhead light and the faint radio traffic from the patrol car. Brian Cole watched Eric's face change. The certainty disappeared first, then the defensiveness. What remained was the realization that every question, every delay, and every refusal to accept verification had been recorded while he was speaking to a senior federal official inside her own home. Danielle did not smile. She did not cross her arms. She did not ask whether he knew who she was. She simply waited. Eric looked down at the credential again as if reading it a second time might produce a different answer. "You work for the Department of Justice?" he asked. Danielle's expression remained steady. "That is what the identification says." Brian glanced toward the patrol radio. Dispatch repeated the property confirmation, stating clearly that Danielle Brooks was listed as the homeowner at the address where they were standing. Two separate facts now sat in front of Eric. Her federal identity. Her ownership of the property. Neither fact changed what had already happened. They only removed his ability to pretend the situation had remained uncertain. Eric handed the credential back. "Why did you not tell us who you were from the beginning?" Danielle accepted it carefully. "I told you who I was. I gave you my driver's license." Eric opened his mouth, but she continued. "My job title was never required to prove I lived here." Brian looked down. He knew she was right. Eric tried another explanation. "We get calls like this all the time. People use false addresses. We have to be careful." Danielle nodded. "Careful is checking. Careful is confirming. You did that. Then you kept going." The words were quiet, but Brian felt them more sharply than if she had raised her voice. Eric looked toward the body camera on his chest. Danielle noticed. "The problem is not that you responded to a call," she said. "The problem is what happened after the call was resolved." Across the street, Sarah Mitchell had stepped from her porch into the driveway. She was close enough now to understand that something had gone badly wrong. She looked toward Danielle with an expression full of regret, but did not approach. Brian finally spoke. "Sergeant, the residence is confirmed. The vehicle is confirmed. The identification is confirmed." Eric turned toward him. "I know." Brian did not look away. "Then we should end the detention." The word detention seemed to strike Eric differently now. He looked at Danielle. "You are free to go inside." Danielle remained where she was. "Before I do, I want the event number." Eric hesitated. "For the call. For the entire contact." Brian immediately reached toward the patrol computer to retrieve it. Eric watched him, then looked back at Danielle. "Are you planning to file a complaint?" Danielle's face showed no satisfaction. "I am planning to make sure the record is complete." That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. A moment later, Danielle's phone vibrated on the workbench. The screen showed a secure callback from a Department of Justice security contact. She looked at it, then at Eric. Your credential check triggered a notification. Eric's expression tightened. Brian stopped typing. Danielle answered the call. Brooks. She listened for several seconds. Yes, I am at my residence. Yes, local officers are present. Another pause. No, there is no emergency. I want the interaction documented and the footage preserved. Eric looked toward Brian. Brian looked toward the body cameras. Danielle ended the call and placed the phone back on the workbench. A security liaison will contact your department to confirm the credential inquiry. Eric exhaled slowly. The reveal had already happened, but the consequences were only beginning to take shape. He had thought discovering Danielle's title was the worst possible moment. It was not. The harder truth was that her title did not create the problem. It only made it impossible to ignore what the cameras had already captured. The call from the Department of Justice Security liaison reached the local department before Eric Dalton had finished writing down the event number. Less than 15 minutes later, another patrol vehicle turned onto the street, followed by an unmarked department sedan. Captain Laura Hayes stepped out first. She was in plain professional clothing beneath a dark department jacket, carrying a tablet, and wearing the expression of someone who had already been briefed enough to know this was no longer a routine property check. Danielle Brooks remained inside the garage beside the workbench, her groceries still where she had left them. Brian Cole stood near the patrol car. Eric stayed closer to the driveway, holding his notebook. Captain Hayes looked from one officer to the other, then toward Danielle. Ms. Brooks. Danielle nodded. Yes. I am Captain Hayes. I understand there was a detention connected to a suspicious person call. Eric spoke immediately. Captain, the call came in as possible unauthorized entry. We were verifying residency. Hayes looked toward him. And was residency verified? Eric hesitated. Brian answered. Yes, ma'am. Hayes turned toward Brian. When? That was the question nobody wanted to answer. Brian looked at Danielle, then at his own body camera. Her driver's license matched the address almost immediately. Eric shifted his weight. Brian continued. The vehicle registration matched too. Then the garage application matched. Dispatch later confirmed the property record. Hayes did not react outwardly, but her eyes changed. She looked at Eric. Why did the detention continue after that? Eric opened his notebook. There were still inconsistencies. Danielle spoke for the first time since Hayes arrived. Which inconsistencies? Eric looked toward her, but did not answer immediately. Hayes waited. Sergeant, he finally said. The original caller did not recognize her. There were federal materials in the vehicle. I wanted to be certain everything was legitimate. Hayes looked toward the leather work bag. The federal materials belonged to her. Yes. The credential was legitimate? Yes. Another silence. Danielle could feel the entire encounter narrowing down to something simple. Not whether Eric had been allowed to respond. Not whether he had been allowed to ask initial questions. The issue was why every confirmation had created another demand instead of ending the suspicion. Hayes looked at Danielle. What are you requesting at this point? Danielle's answer came without hesitation. Preserve both body camera recordings. Preserve the dispatch audio, the call notes, the vehicle query, the property verification, and Sergeant Dalton's written notes exactly as they exist now. Eric looked up. You think I changed something? Danielle held his gaze. I think records should be preserved before anyone has to remember what happened. Hayes gave a short nod. That is reasonable. She turned to Brian. Did you observe anything during the contact that you believe should be documented separately? Brian swallowed. This was the moment his silence became a choice. He looked at Eric, then at Hayes. Yes, ma'am. Eric's expression tightened. Brian continued. I saw that the address matched early. I said so. Later I ran the plate, and it matched too. I thought we should end the contact sooner. Hayes asked, Did you say that clearly? Brian looked down. Not clearly enough. Danielle watched him. There was no satisfaction in her face. Brian was not trying to save himself. He was admitting that recognizing something was wrong and acting on that recognition were not the same thing. Hayes looked toward Eric again. Sergeant, until this is reviewed, I am reassigning you away from public contact duties. Eric stared at her. Captain, this is because she works for the Department of Justice? Danielle answered before Hayes could. No, everyone looked at her. If this only matters because of my title, then we have learned nothing. Hayes nodded slowly. Danielle continued. The review should focus on what happened before anyone knew where I worked. Eric looked toward the garage camera above the interior door. The red light was still on. His own body camera was still recording. Brian's was too. The record was everywhere now. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just complete. Hayes asked Danielle whether she wanted to make a formal statement that evening. Danielle looked at the grocery bags on the floor, then toward the open kitchen door. Tomorrow, she said. Tonight, I would like to finish bringing my groceries inside. Hayes stepped back. Of course. Eric lowered his eyes. For the first time since arriving, nobody was asking Danielle to prove she belonged there. The proof had been present from the beginning. What changed was not the truth. What changed was that the people responsible for ignoring it were finally being required to explain why. 3 weeks later, the garage looked exactly as it had that evening. The same warm overhead light. The same shelves along the wall. The same quiet street beyond the open door. But Danielle Brooks could no longer step into that space without remembering how quickly an ordinary night had become a lesson in what happens when suspicion survives every fact placed in front of it. The administrative review had moved faster than she expected, not because of her position, but because the record was unusually complete. 2. Body cameras. A garage camera. A doorbell camera. Dispatch audio. Vehicle registration records. County property confirmation. Eric Dalton's handwritten notes. Brian Cole's statement. There was very little room for anyone to argue about sequence. The review did not conclude that responding to the neighbor's call had been improper. In fact, the department made that clear. Officers were allowed to investigate a report of possible unauthorized entry. The problem began after Danielle's identification matched the address. It deepened when the vehicle registration matched. It became harder to justify when the garage account matched. And by the time county records confirmed ownership, the original uncertainty was gone. What remained was choice. Eric had been removed from public contact duties during the review and ordered into additional training while the department examined whether earlier complaints showed a similar pattern. No dramatic announcement followed. No instant firing. No public spectacle. Danielle preferred it that way. Accountability meant more to her when it came through evidence and procedure instead of humiliation. Brian's statement became important for another reason. He admitted that he recognized the encounter should have ended earlier, but failed to challenge his supervisor clearly. The department required him to complete intervention training and added new guidance reminding officers that rank did not remove responsibility. Captain Laura Hayes also ordered a review of verification practices across the entire shift. The changes were not revolutionary. They were simple. If identification matched an address, document it. If independent records confirmed residency, say so. If an officer chose to continue a detention after verification, the reason had to be specific and recorded. Danielle understood the irony. Sometimes justice moved through grand courtrooms and major decisions. Sometimes it arrived through one added line in a policy manual because somebody finally asked why the old line had not been enough. That Saturday evening, Danielle returned from the grocery store and opened the garage as usual. She had just lifted a bag from the back of her vehicle when she heard footsteps near the driveway. Sarah Mitchell stood several feet away, holding a small container covered with a kitchen towel. She looked nervous. Ms. Brooks. Danielle turned. Sarah took a breath. I owe you an apology. Danielle waited. Sarah looked toward the street. I was the one who called. I did not know you. I heard about the thefts, and I thought I was being careful. Her voice dropped. But I keep thinking about what happened after that. Danielle set the grocery bag down. Calling to report something you genuinely did not understand was not the part that concerned me most. Sarah looked surprised. Danielle continued. You gave them a question. They received the answer. Sarah's eyes lowered. I should have introduced myself before any of this. That would have helped, Danielle said gently. Sarah gave a small, embarrassed smile and offered the container. Banana bread. Peace offering. Danielle accepted it. Thank you. Across the street, children rode bicycles under the porch lights while someone walked a dog along the sidewalk. The neighborhood felt ordinary again. Sarah hesitated before leaving. Did they ever explain why they kept questioning you? Danielle looked toward the garage camera above the door. The red light blinked once. They explained what they were thinking, she said. That is not always the same as explaining why the facts stopped matching. Sarah nodded slowly and walked home. Danielle carried the groceries into the kitchen, then returned for the final bag. Before closing the garage, She looked once at the driveway where Eric and Brian had stood. The memory no longer felt like a confrontation. It felt like evidence of something simpler and more important. The question had never been whether officers were allowed to check. The question was why the checking continued after the truth was already in their hands.